half of CEOs report feeling lonely. What that means is that if you are an entrepreneur, if you're building a company and you are lonely, if you are isolated, you're not your best self. Yes, your happiness goes up as you keep making more money, but...
Dr. Robert Waldinger.
One of the world's longest health studies, the world's longest scientific study of happiness, is now in its 85th year. There were 724 participants.
One president of the United States.
In his TED Talk, which still one of the 10 most viewed TED Talks of all time.
The clearest message that we get from this study is this. Yes, blood pressure mattered and cholesterol mattered and health in general mattered, but the biggest predictor of who was going to be not just happy, but healthy was...
That sounds like something the world of today really, really needs to take to heart. Welcome to another episode of Unlock Your Potential. So glad to be back with you, having amazing conversations with amazing human beings. Today, as usual, we are joined by an amazing human being, Dr. Robert Waldinger. He is a practicing psychiatrist, an author, a Zen Priest, and perhaps most notably, at least in his professional career, director of the Harvard Study of Adult Development, which is, as I understand it, I'll let him explain it more precisely than myself, but it's basically the longest and largest longitudinal study of human life, adult development, human outcomes, and ultimately what makes us happy and fulfilled. In his brand new book, The Good Life, he actually delves into the results of that study, offering a world of lessons on what the good life really looks like. And his TED Talk, which I've actually seen multiple times and rewatched this morning, is one of, I believe, still one of the 10 most viewed TED Talks of all time. If you recognize him, that's perhaps where it's from. Dr. Robert Waldinger, welcome to Unlock Your Potential.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
No, I'm so glad you're here. Like I said, I rewatched your TED Talk this morning. I'd probably seen it four or five times. You know, I'm a pretty big fan of the TED verse, so to speak. And I guess we can perhaps jump right to the conclusion, lowercase conclusion. I suspect it's more multifaceted than to simply say the conclusion. But basically, relationships. The health of our relationships is at the core of the quality of our life.
Yeah.
Fair enough?
Yeah. That basically we've followed the same people, the same families for 85 years. And our big question was, what actually makes people thrive as they go through life? And we were blown away when we began to find that, yes, blood pressure mattered and cholesterol mattered and health in general mattered, but that the biggest predictor of who was going to be not just happy, but healthy was the quality of people's relationships with other people. And that many other studies began to find the same thing, and we began to have a lot of confidence in this as a very robust finding about adult life.
So I'll tell you immediately where my mind just went, and we can see if it's fertile ground worth treading into. So I just had like a deja vu moment of the other time in my life when somebody referred to the greatest predictor of the quality of life, or the probability of a positive human outcome. And it was the well-known, and I'm sure you're familiar with, the Stanford marshmallow experiment, right?
Oh, yeah.
Very familiar with, which says that essentially makes the same claim about the attribute of delayed gratification, the ability to delay gratification. And so I'm wondering if there's a thread here that suggests that delayed gratification, or what we might call impulse control, or, there's other ways to say it, actually is one side of the good relationship coin, and they're actually two sides of the same coin, and thus they're both true. I'm curious if and maybe I'm being too narrow in getting to a larger question, which is like, what traits allow a person to create good relationships so that they can then create a good quality of life? And perhaps delayed gratification is one of them based on that other experiment.
Well, you're pointing out something interesting that nobody's actually ever pointed to before, and I think it is related. So, the question is why don't we pay attention to relationships? I mean, we pay attention to money and fame and winning prizes and all that as supposedly making us happy, which they don't. But why don't we pay attention to relationships? And one of the factors might be that relationships are complicated. They take persistence. They take grit. They take delaying gratification. So, if my friend does something I'm not so happy with, do I have to explode right away or have a negative reaction, or can I step back, think about it, really, sit with it a while? It's that kind of living with complexity, delaying my reaction until I have a chance to think about it, choose how I want to react. Then all of that may be related to the marshmallow experiment.
Yeah.
These kids are asked, don't just grab for the marshmallow. Think about it. You're going to get something extra if you wait a little while, right?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think there's, delayed gratification is probably a skill for building quality relationships. Like you said, not blowing up because somebody upsets you, but, having the larger context of the relationship in mind. And delayed gratification is also an aspect of relationships, that they themselves are a long-term, slow growth, compounding investment that really bears more fruit the more time you give it. And it's decades down the road. So it's interesting. You know what I mean? It's both something that, so it's something that helps you build quality relationships. And then it's also probably something that helps you appreciate and value relationships over time. So yeah, I wonder if they really are two ways of saying the same thing in a sense.
Well, they're probably not the same thing, right? Because delayed gratification can be one part of relationships, but another part of relationships is just plain old fun. It's like, right now, am I having a good time, right? And that's really important in some relationships, not all. So I would say that there's never any one magic key to anything, right? And when you study thousands of lives, that's what you learn. But they do know that being able to delay gratification is a great asset in your life. Similarly, nurturing relationships that includes some delayed gratification, that's also a huge asset in your life. And we can talk about that at your work life as well as your private life. So they're related, but they're not identical.
So I'll tell you, before the interview, I was thinking, about the dynamic of this conversation and what an interesting subject you present for me, so to speak. Forgive the term. Because I feel like your thesis, or kind of the position that you represent via your TED Talk and your work and what it sounds like is kind of the core premise of your book, is sort of this general formula for happiness for everyone, right? That, if we were plotting a bell curve, you would be speaking to the big fat middle of the bell curve right now, right? In that sense. But also, my show in particular doesn't actually normally deal with the big fat middle of the bell curve. I'm trying to find outliers, people who are particularly high achievers or high performers in their various disciplines, and distill, okay, what makes the difference, right? What is it that's happening out at the fringe of the curve, right? Not necessarily how to satisfy ourselves by being in the middle of it. And so you present sort of both poles, right? Where you've got all this massive body of research around essentially how anybody can be happy, but you yourself, let's look at you. You're a psychiatrist. There's a lot of psychiatrists in the world. Not all of them end up the director of the Harvard Study for Adult Development, right? You're an elite achiever within your own category. So you kind of give us opportunity to discuss both, I think. So
right.
I hope you're okay if we get into you personally, not just the study and the body of work that you're here to speak about.
Absolutely. And actually, so I'm going to look at it through that lens of relationships because that's what I've been studying. But if you think about it, you're right. You're absolutely right. I mean, I am a high achiever by most standards. But a lot of what got me, so for example, I'm director of this study because I got to know the previous director. We were together on a trip to Moscow in the 90s during the Gorbachev era, and we were there to discuss mental health with the Soviets. And I got to know the previous director, George Valiant, and we hit it off. Now, there are a lot of smart, high-achieving people in the world, but I happened to make a connection with this very interesting man who was running this really cool study. He came to me about 10 years later and said, how would you like to inherit my study? So yes, it had to do with my achievements up to that time, but it had a lot to do with the connection that we had made. And that's one of the things that research finds, that actually even our peripheral connections, our casual relationships are the place we're most likely to find our next opportunity, because they're people who aren't in our usual networks. They aren't our nearest and dearest. So what I would say is that, yes, you're absolutely right that being a high achiever matters, but one of the facets of high achievement is making these connections well, and it's getting better and better at those connections.
So as you know, and as we discussed a little before the show, you know, my body of work is really about that nexus point between personal and professional development. You know, as an entrepreneurial advocate, I have sort of this position that I occupy in the macro conversation, that like there is a way to be in the modern world and the modern economy that allows us to synergize our personal life and our professional life and really kind of get to this wholeness of being, this oneness where who we are and what we do. You know, they say, oh, well, when somebody says, well, what do you do? It's almost, you know, there's become this kind of vein in society that's like, oh, well, it's a negative if you answer that question with your job title. It's like, well, you're supposed to say, I'm a parent, or I'm a husband, or like I'm a Led Zeppelin aficionado, or whatever you're supposed to say now that's more cool. But the reality is we spend most of our time doing our work.
Yeah.
So instead of acting like that's the dark side of our life, why not just figure out a way to bring it all together and to live a congruent life where we love? And it feels like that's something you would embody too, where like you find deep passion and fulfillment in your work. It's not just like what you clock into to pay for the actual life that you want to live. And so that's what I represent in the world. And so I love that we've connected relationships and the skill of developing quality relationships as a bridge to both a successful personal life and a successful professional life, which your story just really embodied.
Absolutely. And, you know, you think about how much of our waking life we spend working, and it's really important to not separate that out from relationships. And we know, you know, that the most successful people are the people who have the best people skills. Mm-hmm. So, you know, as we were saying, the other thing is, I think you're speaking to this tendency we sometimes have to keep our lives in silos, right? And I used to do that. So I'm a psychiatrist. I'm also a psychoanalyst. I do talk therapy, which is unusual for psychiatrists. And I'm a Zen Priest. Now, those seem like a weird collection of things. Plus, I'm a researcher. What I've realized is that the more I bring all that stuff together, I'm more productive, I'm happier, I do more interesting work. So my Zen meditation practice and teaching makes me ask different questions in my research. It makes me ask different questions with my patients as a psychiatrist. So when I break down the walls of the silos and try to live a more, you know, continuous life, boy, has it made me more creative.
Yeah, so that's interesting. Reminds me of Scott Peck, whose work I'm sure you're familiar with, psychiatrist and also a Jesuit priest, I believe.
Yeah.
I wonder how many people that work in mental health or mental medicine related fields have that spiritual vein to their life that perhaps they're not as bold about bringing front and center into their work. Can you unpack Zen Priest for me a little more, like how you got there and what that truly means?
Yeah. Well, I started out being really interested in Buddhism and particularly Buddhist thinking. And it helped me understand my own preoccupation with stuff that ultimately doesn't matter.
Yeah.
like winning awards, like getting super rich, because if you think about it, I mean, unless getting rich enables you to do certain things, it's just it's just a bottom line. It's just
Right.
a dollar, right? So the question is, why do people get preoccupied with stuff that doesn't matter? And Buddhism really helps me with that. It really helps me temper the glorifying of achievement and think more about meaningful work. And so I found that Buddhist philosophy was super helpful. And then I started practicing, and boy, did Zen meditation add a lot to my life. And then being a Zen priest is a vow of service. So my vow was to basically try to help other people, not just to be concerned with myself and my own advancement. And that's what I've been trying to do, both in my Zen teaching, in my work with patients, in my research. And it's really added a huge amount to my life. I never used to consider myself a spiritual person, certainly not a religious person. So to be having this life as a Zen teacher and a Zen priest is like, whoa, where did that come from? But it's just one of those surprises that I find in all the lives I study, that life isn't predictable, that you end up finding your way, and that ends up being the most interesting part of life for me.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So I want to circle back to the Zen priest bit. That's really interesting to me. But first, another question pops to mind. You're familiar, I assume, with, and I did a little bit of research on this when I was writing my book last year, the work of Angus Deaton and Daniel Kahneman at Princeton, which was the sort of the happiness study, and that's the study that sort of famously produced the observation that money beyond the point of basic provision doesn't directly correlate to emotional well-being. But what I was interested about that study, because that's the thing that is sort of like, in every fourth Huffington Post article, somebody's going to reference, like, see, you don't need to be rich to be happy, right?
Right.
But there was another facet of that study that used an assessment, I believe, known as Cantrell's ladder.
Yeah.
Or the life satisfaction index.
Yeah.
Which is essentially, and for the audience, it basically asks, and you can correct me or probably set me straight on a better description of this, but as I understand it, it basically says, envision your idealized life as the top of the ladder, and how far up the ladder do you self-assess, self-evaluate yourself as being, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And that in that dimension of questioning, they found that general life satisfaction actually does correlate to financial wherewithal to almost an infinite degree, because your ability to manifest the idealized version of your life is going to increase in direct proportion to your resources. So I'm curious if you can unpack all that for me and how that comports with your research.
Well, it's very interesting because they just published a paper last month.
Okay, you're way ahead of me then. I'm like 10 years behind here.
Kahneman and a guy named Matt Killingsworth did a adversarial collaboration, they called it, because Killingsworth found that your happiness does go up as you make more and more money, even after your basic needs are met. And so they did this adversarial collaboration, and what they came out with was a kind of complicated picture that says, yes, your happiness goes up as you keep making more money, but if you're unhappy and you're looking for more money to make you happier, it doesn't work. So happy people can get happier, can feel like they're living even more their ideal life if they make more money. Unhappy people don't get happier when they make more and more money. So it's not an aspiration that you really want to invest a lot in. The other thing is, when you ask about living your best life, that's only one way to think about life satisfaction. So if I imagine my best life, it's a life I've never lived yet. So when I imagine my best life, I guess, unfortunately, what comes to mind is a lot of the advertisements I see every day these pictures of what ideal lives are supposed to be like, or these
Right.
Instagram feeds, that's all fantasy. Those are all curated lives that are presented to us as what we're supposed to aspire to. When you ask people what actually life is like and what goes well for them, wealth doesn't really do it. So it also depends on how you measure it.
So do you think it's true to say, this is something we say a lot in the entrepreneurial development world that I inhabit, we say a lot that money is essentially a multiplier, or an amplifier, that money doesn't change you, money makes you more of who you are, and which is a deeply qualitative statement, but I wonder if there's a middle layer that's like, money makes your experience more of what it already was too. So I'm curious your take on that idea that money simply magnifies your pre-existing experience to the extent you get more of it.
Yeah. I mean, I can speak to that from the point of view of what they call the hedonic treadmill, this idea that we all have a kind of happiness set point.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure and the listeners will know that there's a study of what happens to people after they have big life events like winning the lottery. Okay, so coming into a lot of money, or like becoming wheelchair bound, having an accident and becoming paralyzed, right? And what they find is that both coming into a ton of money and being paralyzed, a year later, you're basically about back to your previous happiness set point. And so what that means is, money could be an amplifier, but then you're basically going to be about as happy generally as you were before you got the money. And so that's just another way to say that unless the money is for a particular purpose, in which case it's different. Like if you say, I want this to happen in the world, and making money, using my money will allow me to do that, that's a different story, because that's using the money as a vehicle for a particular purpose that you want to achieve. Many people go at the aim of making money as just an end in itself. That turns out to be not so sass.
Yeah, so it almost sounds like we're saying, and this is going to cut against the grain of the modern, pharmaceutical quick fix mentality, but that when it comes to true life satisfaction or fulfillment or joy, or I don't know, whatever the right noun is, any attempt at a quick fix is destined only to produce a short-term result, meaning millions of dollars, a year later, you're going to be right back where you were. Or if something veers negative, a year later, you're going to be right back where you were. But to our earlier comments about delayed gratification, slow, methodical, intentional investments in long-term quality relationships that compound produce a long-term fulfillment outcome, but it's almost like there is no short-term fulfillment intervention, is kind of how it feels.
That's exactly right. That all the fulfillment interventions that work are practices, right? Yeah. So that's what it is. So for example, I have a meditation practice. I don't meditate once and then say I'm done, right? Yeah. Similarly, physical fitness, similarly, any other kind of wellness practice that you do, yoga, Tai Chi, religious practice, it's ongoing.
And relationships.
Exactly. Social fitness that we talk about in the book is an ongoing practice, little actions that you do every day, every week. And same with creation of wealth, creation of lifestyle, that it's an ongoing practice that's going to get you somewhere, whereas quick fixes generally are flashes in the pan.
So has the study revealed, any of the tactics or the practices that actually go into forging quality lifelong relationships? Because obviously the study has revealed that lifelong relationships are the key to a good life, but has it really taught us how to actually create those?
Yes. And a lot of it has to do with small actions to maintain the connections you have. So one of the things we saw is that many people who had perfectly good relationships in their 20s didn't do anything to take care of them. And you would watch these perfectly good relationships wither away and die from neglect. But the people who were really good at this would just do small actions. They made sure to see or talk to friends, family that regularly. And we can do that, right? You could, at the end of this podcast, you could think of somebody you miss or would like to connect with and just send them a text or send them an email. And you will be amazed at how many times people will come back to you saying, I'm so glad you reached out. Not every time, but most of the time. And the people who were best at this did that. The other thing is that the people who were best at this, who, let's say you don't have enough people in your life, the people who were good at developing new relationships were the people who invested in what we call social capital. They joined clubs. They went to houses of worship. They volunteered for good causes, for political campaigns. They joined bowling leagues, anything to sort of do something that you care about alongside other people. And that was the best way to develop new relationships and bring new people into your life.
Yeah, one thing that struck me on my, whatever it was, fourth or fifth viewing of your TED Talk, and I love, rewatching or re-listening to anything. You always catch new things. But one thing that I caught this most recent listening or viewing was when you talked about replacing relationships, that, people that, let's say they retire and they lose their peer group or their workplace friends, it's the people that proactively replace those workmates. You said workmates with playmates.
Yeah.
In their new environment, and essentially never allowing that void to develop in your life.
Right. And or recognizing the void and doing something about it. Like a lot of people take their workmates for granted. And then when they retire, they look around and say, oh my God, where did everybody go? Yeah. And they realize, oh, I took all these people for granted. And then they get busy. The people who are happiest in retirement get busy making new relationships. And I think that's, you think about it, if we move for a job, move to a different city, again, we have to start over. So there are these very particular actions you can take to make new relationships. They're tried and true. They really work.
Can you share them briefly? If somebody missed that day in kindergarten of like making a friend 101.
Yeah. Well, it's what I said. It's volunteering. It's joining clubs. It's joining organizations. If you think about it, when you get to high school or college, the first thing they offer you is the chance to join clubs. And it's because they know that's a way for people to start getting connected to each other. So do that again when you move to a new city. Similarly, do this at work. And one of the ways we can do this is to just notice things, be curious about other people. So let's say you're at work and you notice that somebody has something displayed on their desktop, or if you're on Zoom, they have something in their background. You ask about it, be curious. People love it when you're curious about them. People love to talk about themselves. It's a very good way to strike up conversations and to start developing new relationships. So curiosity is a huge driver of new relationships.
So I have two questions that I hope we have time to delve into. I have about 13 minutes left till I'm committed to letting you off to your next appointment. And I'll say them both so that we can try to manage the time. One is, I'll say, going to be about, I'll ask the question in more detail, but it's basically going to be about the correlation between relationships and professional success. So I'll re-ask that in more detail. But then the second one is actually going to be about young people and how much of your research you've been able to apply to young people. So we'll set that aside. First question then is, like I said, so the sort of the soundbite takeaway from your at least your TED Talk and the kind of underlying thesis here is, hey, it's not about money, it's not about professional success, it's not about esteem, it's about relationships, right? Like those are the investments to make. But I'm curious how much the research, because we've also said that relationships are great professional currency. Relationships have huge value. For example, a relationship resulted in this role that you're in, right? So I'm curious, has the data revealed any correlation between your aptitude at creating relationships and maintaining and nurturing relationships and measurable professional outcomes?
Yes, it has. So we have a whole chapter about this in the book, The Good Life, that we just published.
Yeah.
And there's good research, not just from us, but from other studies that show that the people who have at least one friend at work are better performers at work. They're more engaged in their jobs. And of course, they're happier. They're less likely to leave their jobs for some other job because you have people who matter to you at work. So all these parameters matter. That's actually useful information for entrepreneurs, for people building companies, and for CEOs, that these connections at work aren't distractions. They're the opposite. They actually build productivity and engagement of your workforce.
And retention.
Which
in the modern workplace as a CEO, I mean, you're all about, it's expensive to find and train good people. How do I hold on to them? And it sounds like foster an environment of personal connection.
Exactly.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, okay, that's fascinating. We'll go into that more if we have time. So the second question that I alluded to was in reference to the study. Obviously, at this point, you're basically studying 90-year-olds. I mean, the study's 80 years going. How long has the study been going on now?
Well, it's 85 years, but now we're studying the children who are all baby boomers.
So you've got children now in the mix. So I'm curious,
yeah.
What are these truisms percolating down through generations?
Yeah, a lot of these truisms percolate through generations. Absolutely. Particularly the things around work and relationships.
So because there's a lot of sort of negative stereotypes out there in the world about millennials and Gen Z and younger generations as like, well, they don't even manage relationships anymore. And there's even a term, IRL, right? In real life. Right. It's like, I don't have time for IRL. It's, my whole life is online. My whole life is this curated feed. My whole life are these, quasi-anonymous interactions on Reddit or comment threads or whatever. And I'm curious, how much of, do you ever have opportunity in your work to actually try to bring, well, what's interesting though, actually, as I'm asking the question, your TED Talk was at a school, right?
It was at a little elementary school in suburban Boston.
So do you get to try to bring this consciousness to children much?
I don't do it personally, but there's now a whole area called socio-emotional learning, which is developing curriculum for kids where they teach kids, this is what feelings are. This is how you make a friend. This is what happens when you have an argument with your friend. This is what bullying looks like. This is how you can stand up against bullies. There are all these skills. And what they find is when they teach kids this in the classroom, kids, they get into trouble less. They're happier in school. They get kicked out of school much less often. They do better at their academic subjects when they have these. So when you teach these skills to kids, it goes a long way.
So it seems like, and even the context of this conversation, I'm down here right now, before the interview, you're asking where I am. So I live in Utah, but right now I'm in Central Texas at a camp where my company is hosting a personal development event that really focuses on soft skills, communication, interpersonal relationships, emotional self-regulation. It's all the stuff that we might fit under the heading of ways to build better relationships.
Yeah.
And this is part of an entrepreneurial education program, right? Because our belief is deeply that those are the skills that produce the possibility of better professional outcomes. But it almost seems like the general statement is for you to be productive and do your best work, you have to get the unhappiness dealt with. It's not like, it's like like you were talking about the kids, unhappiness or conflict or fighting with their friends or inability to maintain positive interactions is like distraction and an energy drain that prevents them from exceeding in academics. It's not like they're smarter without those things, but it's just like they get it out of the way.
Exactly. Like if you're really upset, it's harder to learn to read or to learn your multiplication tables, right? Mm-hmm. And similarly at work, if you are upset, if you are preoccupied, if you're lonely, you just don't engage as much. So if you learn these people skills that you're teaching the people in your company, it goes a long way to free up their energy. It frees up energy to do the stuff they want to do at work.
So to the audience, knowing that we have a very entrepreneurial audience that listens to this show, we could sort of make the general statement that all of the professional goals and the business goals and entrepreneurial goals that you might have, the best version of those or the highest probability of realizing those is to some degree dependent on getting your personal life in good working order so that you're free to do the work.
Exactly. And the other thing we know from, actually, there was a Gallup poll about this. Half of CEOs report feeling lonely much of the time. What that means is that if you are an entrepreneur, if you're building a company and you are lonely, if you are isolated, you're not your best self. You can't bring your best game to work. So if there's a lot you can do to remedy that, both in your own workplace and in getting support from other entrepreneurs.
Yeah, I mean, that last bit, support from other entrepreneurs, the concept of the mastermind or having that networking group. I mean, I can just speak for myself as a CEO and an entrepreneur that, without other people that I can speak to that I feel like have some relative context of the types of challenges that I'm facing, I don't know. I don't think I could do it. I mean, it's
absolutely.
So, okay, then as I'll kind of, let's say, end with this last question. We touched on earlier delayed gratification as one of the possible skills that seem to be a really significant input into the ability to build great relationships over the course of a life. You also talked about just, consistency. It sounds like consistency of communication, just the actual staying in touch with people, not letting too much, water run under the bridge. Are there any other skills or practices that have revealed themselves through your research of like, these are the contributions or towards building great relationships over time that you need to be making?
Yeah. So one I mentioned before a little bit, which is curiosity. Let yourself be curious about other people. And particularly when they say something that worries or upsets you, be curious as opposed to just reacting. The other thing is that if we think about ongoing relationships, including at work, everybody is changing all the time. So we are changing day to day. That means that our relationships are going to change. And that means that we want to be sensitive to that, be curious, interested about how people are changing. Maybe their interests are changing. Maybe something's changing at home. Or maybe they want to take a new path in their career development, and to be curious, interested, and maybe supportive of that goes a long way toward keeping a relationship strong and stable. That includes with your employees.
So I love what you said. I wish we had more time to drill into this. When something upsets you, developing the responsiveness rather than the reactiveness to say, I'm going to be curious about that. I'm going to find out more. I'm actually going to lean into it, but not aggressively. That sounds like something the world of today, like, really, really needs to take to heart.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah.
Man, that's fascinating. Okay, listen, we're out of time. Tragic. I hope I can get you back. I feel like we've set the stage for like 5 really interesting conversations now that I would love to have. But before we wrap, please share with the world. Obviously, you have a new book out. You are I see you on podcasts here and there. Tell the world how they can go get more Dr. Robert Waldinger goodness.
Oh, okay. Well, my website is robertwaldinger, all one word, .com. The book is at thegoodlifebook.com. And I'm on LinkedIn. I'm also on Insight Timer if you're a meditator. You can listen to Dharma Talks.
If you loved that episode, then you're definitely going to love this one. Check it out.
Pleasure and pain work like opposite sides of a balance. When we experience pleasure, the way that our brains get us back to the level position is first by tipping to the side of pain. As we become addicted, we are compulsively pursuing our drug in the total absence of joy.